Hey everyone, and welcome to the Microsoft Fabric session on data warehousing with Andy Cutler and myself here in the studio. So this week we got probably the Christmas came early, something like that, gift from Microsoft. We got the Microsoft Fabric platform product. Microsoft Fabric is the new unified platform that combines all the capabilities and tools from data warehousing, data factory, Synapse Analytics, serverless SQL, dedicated SQL, all the tools we know and love from Azure combined into one unified software as a service platform in Microsoft Fabric, right the same place where we used to have the Power BI service. So right next to Power BI, all these bunch of extra capabilities and a lot of other things also announced to be coming soon, like Data Activator and more. So we just expanded our toolbox with so many tools that I cannot even count it. And we have been working almost day and night for the past few days to get a grasp of everything around the platform, everything we can do, every tool and technology. And today we are ready to present and broadcast around Microsoft Fabric for all you guys. This is the second session of the day. We had one earlier, which you should be able to watch on YouTube if you missed it, where we covered Fabric as a whole. In this session that we will starting out, we are covering the data warehousing aspect of Microsoft Fabric. And later today, we will have a visit from Microsoft talking about the exploring the changes to Power BI as a result of Microsoft Fabric with a specific focus on a new direct lake feature. Should be really interesting. Finally, finalizing the day with a talk about how we should think about this whole concept of Microsoft Fabric as an organization. But right now, it's time for a session that I've looked very much forward to, a session on how we can do data warehousing in a software as a service platform in Microsoft Fabric. And to tell you guys about this, we have invited no one other than Andy Cutler, a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, an independent consultant who is probably one of the leading experts on anything around Azure data platforming, Azure Synapse Analytics, and so forth. So welcome to the studio, Andy. Been looking so much forward to having you.
Good morning, Mathias. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great. How about you?
Very well. Although I'm pretty jealous. I actually want to be in that studio where you are right now. So it looks really good.
Yeah.
But thank you for inviting me on. Yeah.
I had colleagues asking me, shouldn't we just invite him over here? And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's a bit far from where you are to Denmark, just to be
next time with a bit more notice. I'll be there. Yeah, I'll be there, or a virtual studio.
Yeah. So how are you? Are you all rested and stuff? Because I'm not. I think I've been up all day, all night for the past few days.
It's been a strange one to have been hands-on with Fabric for the last few months, and then see it all announced, and it just have that big bang of all of those sessions that went public around data integration, data science, all the workloads within Fabric. And it's almost like that, that feeling of relief, like it's out there now. Yeah. But as you said, there's been sessions through the night, and what you want to do is you want to be in those sessions and chatting with people as it's happening. Absolutely. And as the announcements are coming through. So yes, you've got, your day-to-day workload, and then you've got to jump into all these sessions after hours as well, plus all the social media stuff. So it's been, I think I'm going to sleep well this weekend.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Sounds good. But today you brought us a session on Synapse Data Factory, which is one of the things that I am personally very, very interested about hearing more about.
Yeah, data warehousing. Yeah, so we're going to talk about data warehousing. So, yes, a couple of days ago, Mathias, fellow mind, are running this really great series of Fabric videos. and invited me on. So this is really some of the things that I've grabbed from the publicly available information and put down, because that's the other thing is, yes, because, you know, we've been hands-on with it over the last few months. We need to make sure that we're not talking about anything that is still private. So basically everything that you see now is publicly available information. It's right there in your Power BI tenant if you want to go ahead and enable Fabric for, you know, a few users to test out. So everything you see here is, you know, completely publicly accessible information that Microsoft have now been marketing. But what we'll do is, you know, me and Mathias, this isn't just about me sitting here and just talking about it for 35 minutes. You know, me and Mathias
could do that, but
yeah, well, that's not going to be that interesting.
No, exactly.
Yeah, we're gonna jump in. We're gonna have some conversations about it because it deserves talking about, because of what Microsoft have done with the data warehousing side of things. So what we'll do is, let's just jump in. So if anyone wants to connect with me, then that QR code, it just takes you to my Twitter account. So it's Mr. Andy Cutler. So if you want to ask any questions or, you know, ask for any resources around any of this, or, you know, carry on the discussion about what we're talking about today, you know, feel free. And obviously LinkedIn, you know, there's my LinkedIn page there as well. So Synapse data warehousing in Fabric. So I've put together some topics to talk through. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, yes, we're going to talk about current Synapse dedicated and serverless SQL pools.
Nice.
Yes. Yeah. We have to. Yeah. We can't just be like, oh, look, there's Fabric data warehousing, and then disregard everything that's happening with current Synapse dedicated and serverless. And it's also helpful to talk about that to understand Fabric Synapse data warehouse, because yeah, it's branded Synapse. So what does that mean in terms of both dedicated and serverless? Then we'll talk about the SQL resources in Fabric in terms of the artifacts that get created, because there's some clarification there I think is particularly useful in terms of SQL endpoints and data warehouses within Fabric. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then learning resources, I've just put together a list of all the things that may interest you if you want to dive into data warehousing specifically. Because look, there's a lot of, like we said, you know, in the intro, there's a lot of stuff around Fabric. And you know what's Mathias, what's also been quite funny this week is, because we've been given information, you know, as and when, week by week as we've worked with it, you know, in private preview, it's never felt overwhelming. It's never felt, you know, there's been a lot to cover. Whereas all of a sudden it gets released this week and there's so much stuff. And of course, I'm working through all of the officially released documentation as well. And I've just realized how much there is.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm overwhelmed, and I assume you are too. So imagine the audience out there who never heard about this since 2 days ago. It's wild.
Exactly. Even me, you know, having had access, is like, oh my word, this is quite overwhelming. You know, there's you know, the overall discussion of what Fabric is. Then there's One Lake. There's, you know, and all of the intricacies around One Lake and the direct lake functionality, then the warehousing and the data science in real time. So yeah, all of a sudden I've got this huge appreciation and empathy with anybody coming at Fabric and thinking, well, where do I begin? Yeah. So you can jump, you know, and the thing is though, you can jump into a workload. So I think, you know, what's of benefit for everybody is if they just pick a workload, and that gives context to everything that you use in Fabric. So instead of coming at it from like the top down and looking at all these myriad workloads that you can run, go bottom up, pick a workload like data warehousing, and then build up from there, and then look to integrate it with other areas of Fabric, because otherwise, yes, it will become a bit overwhelming. So the learning resources, it's just some links to some of the overall Fabric resources, but also to the blog where they're posting, where Microsoft are posting information about each area, and the learning modules. So they've already put together, the learn modules, perhaps a precursor to a Fabric certification. We don't know yet. And then there's some data warehouse specific information in there, as well.
Yeah. Nice.
So, like I said, my slides are pretty basic. They're just talking points. Yeah, they're just talking points. So let's talk about Synapse dedicated and serverless SQL pools and how we've got to where we are with the Fabric side of data warehousing. I think that's probably it's going to give us some context, right, Mathias, to see where we've come from and where we're going, right?
Yep. Absolutely. So if I can mention, maybe start from for some of the Power BI users out there, why we even in the first place had to talk Synapse. And if you ask me, that is because Power BI used to be a front-end tool. So we had the most amazing data modeling capabilities. We had the most amazing reporting capabilities. But when it came to stuff like actual dimensional modeling, creating slowly changing dimensions, surrogate keys if you wanted to do these things, but even anything around history and keeping historical data, snapshots, stuff like that, we hit so many limitations on the back end if we worked only with Power BI, which is where Synapse really shined and gave us all that data warehousing capability. Yeah, and we did that in Synapse. So what was the what was the tools we used in Synapse to accomplish that?
Yeah. So, and when we go through some of the sort of the key points of the Synapse data warehouse platform, it'll provide a bit more context as to why we're talking about Synapse and dedicated and serverless. But ultimately, Synapse is a platform as a service. It's a PaaS service. So when we provision a Synapse workspace, we provision a dedicated SQL pool, as many dedicated SQL pools as we want, or as many dedicated SQL pools as our wallet allows us to buy. But we can provision servers, we can provision dedicated SQL pools, we can configure the size of those SQL pools. We've got settings that we can change. So it's a PaaS service, like Azure SQL databases. So it still gives us all the functionality of SQL, but it also lets us tinker with some of the settings as well. But we don't have to care or worry about hardware. We don't have to worry about patching, anything like that. So Synapse, dedicated and SQL pools are PaaS services. And with Fabric, we're moving to SaaS. We're moving to software as a solution, where the SQL side of things is even more abstracted away. Yeah. So we don't get to, unless we're configuring the size of the Fabric capacity, we're not able to go in and start changing compute settings for the SQL side of things. Now, that's an interesting point when we come to workloads, in a slide later on. But with dedicated SQL pools, we're essentially ingesting data into its own storage. Its own storage is backed by SSDs. So there's fast write, there's fast read. It's an MPP. It's a massively parallel processing system. So it has compute nodes. And as we've said, we can configure and say, well, I want 2 nodes, or I want 4 nodes, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then along came serverless SQL pools when Synapse was announced, because dedicated, it used to be a standalone product called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. It itself was based on the parallel data warehouse system. And what's quite funny is some of the system views in some of the DMVs within dedicated SQL pools still have the PDW prefix, which was parallel data warehouse. So that product has evolved over time into what we know it today as dedicated. Serverless, Microsoft wrote a new engine, the Polaris engine, where we're connecting to data external. So we're reading data from the data lake. But with serverless, it's slightly different with dedicated in that we're not actually importing any data into serverless. We don't have any control over the number of clusters that you're running or the amount of power. It is get the results as quick as you can from serverless.
So from the non Synapse informed or people out there, if you don't load data into anything, how do you store your data? How do you use your data with serverless? What is the storage behind it?
Yeah, so great point. Data lakes. So all of your storage, all of your data that you want to query is in the data lake, which is why serverless SQL pools became very popular in a lakehouse architecture. So if you're processing data using Spark and you're writing that data out to, let's say, the Delta format, the Delta Lake format. So keep Delta in mind when we chat about that in a bit. But essentially, you're landing your data in that Delta format, and then along comes serverless, and it can just query that Delta data using standard SQL. You can connect client tools into it. So Power BI, very common use case where you still want to do some SQL transformation of data in the data lake. You might have volumes of data in your data lake that you want an intermediate compute engine to crunch and aggregate down before loading into Power BI. But essentially, as you can see there, we've got two SQL services. So we've had a lot of, let's say, sessions, blogs, videos about what's the difference.
Yes.
What's the difference between dedicated and serverless? Which should I use in which scenario? And more importantly, why do I have to choose between two SQL endpoints? Because I'm a little confused about which one I use.
Yeah, and then on top of that, there's, that choice is influenced by, are you using Spark for your data transformation? Do you want to do it with SQL? How are you loading in your data? And it all becomes, complicated. Or it can
does,
be.
Yeah. It becomes, yes, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, I know what scenario to use dedicated and I know what scenario to use serverless. But everybody else, may have to go through a journey of understanding those two services.
Yeah.
And the thing is, though, the other issue is that they're two endpoints. They're two different endpoints that you need to connect to. So, two different server URLs to work with, and they don't talk to each other. So within dedicated, you wouldn't be able to write a query straight against serverless SQL pools. You'd just have to go and write it against the data that's in the data lake. And within serverless SQL pools, you're not able to query some data from dedicated, which I thought is I would have liked to have been able to, let's say, enrich data coming from the data lake with some reference data in, let's say, my main data warehouse that's sat in dedicated. Anyway,
so the common theme is it's been semi-fragmented. I mean, it was unified in some way, but it was still kind of fragmented. Different tools didn't really talk to each other, and you needed to be very conscious about how you set up your architecture to make sure that they could actually connect and use each other.
Yes. Yeah.
So
exactly.
what does Microsoft Fabric then change around this? Wow, what's the news?
So, and we've had some discussions on Twitter about this as well. So they've simplified things, but that simplification also needs explaining. So yes. I don't know whether that's whether that's the correct way of saying that they've actually simplified everything. But in terms of the technology, in terms of the SQL technology within Fabric and within Fabric Synapse data warehouses, you've got one SQL service. Yeah. Now this isn't as simple as they've merged dedicated and serverless into a single product, because dedicated, it's got storage nodes that it's storing data in, whereas Fabric, it's storing data in a different format. We'll get onto that in a bit, but we have one SQL engine. That's the most important thing, and it's more based on serverless SQL pools than it is dedicated. So basically, the engine that drives serverless SQL pools, that is essentially what's underpinning Synapse data warehousing. That's why we've got the concept of lake houses that we can query with SQL in Fabric.
Do we know, or are we speculating at this point? Because I mean, we know some things about, for example, the Vertipack engine in Power BI, but do we know anything about the engine here?
So we're on a public broadcast. So I think the answer to that is we have been speculating.
Yeah.
And we've been asking, and we've been getting certain bits of information. So at this point in time, until Microsoft do the decent thing and let us know what they've done under the hood, because again, this is going to be proprietary technology. They'll want to, Microsoft want to protect it.
Yeah.
But I'm because of what's happening and what's happened in Fabric Synapse data warehousing, right? I think it's a good assumption that more of it is pulled from the serverless SQL pools engine. Reason for that is when we come on to talk about some of the points later on around Fabric. Mm-hmm. But what I've got there is I've got SQL Endpoints and I've got warehouse in terms of the Synapse data warehousing. So this is, again, an important consideration for when you're creating artifacts within Fabric. So again, I'm just going to bring up two very simple talking points: SQL endpoints and warehouses. So when I said Microsoft have simplified things, they have from an engine perspective. So we've got one engine, one SQL engine that we're using. So it doesn't matter whether there's data sat in the lakehouse that we're querying, or we're going to import data into a warehouse. We're using the same SQL engine. It's got the same endpoint. Great. Yeah. So we've got one set of SQL commands to know, to understand, and we don't have to learn the idiosyncrasies of two different systems, dedicated and serverless. Yeah. However, when we come to using certain SQL features and certain SQL syntax, there's a difference between what is accessible through a SQL endpoint and what's accessible through a warehouse. Okay, so there's going to be lots of sessions around one lake. So I think, yes, pick a workload to understand, but then also in parallel, do the reading up and learning about one lake. Yeah, because one lake,
pick one workload and then also pick one lake. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, basically data warehousing, one lake.
Yeah,
Power BI, one lake. Machine learning, one lake. Real-time streaming, one lake, because one lake is underpinning all of the workloads. Yeah, with the this concept of just one copy of your data that you can access from all the different workloads.
Yeah, I mean, when they call the new platform a unified platform, I think the one thing that really makes it a unified platform is not the UI; it is one lake. In my opinion.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about just batch versus real-time loading for data warehouses, where sometimes we're trying to use batch processes to provide some lower latency real-time data ingestion, where it's not really meant for that. And one of the problems in data warehousing is how many times you're picking data up, transforming it, and landing it somewhere. Yeah. So we're hoping that with Fabric, we're reducing the overhead of that. So if you've already processed some data and you have it somewhere, you should be able to just access that data through the virtualization features within Fabric, rather than having to create a copy of that data, that you do, in other platforms.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the SQL side of things, when we do create, a lakehouse where we can store files and transform those files into queryable objects, when we create that lakehouse, we automatically get a SQL endpoint that's created. So it is very similar to when you spin up a Synapse workspace and connect it to data lake storage. Serverless SQL pools is there automatically for you to go and query the data lake. It's the same thing here in Fabric. You create the lakehouse, you populate it with files that's being stored in one lake. You then can transform that data in all its weird and wonderful formats into the readable format within Fabric, which is, tables within the lakehouse. That will transform it into the storage format that's being used in Fabric, which is Delta Lake. So Microsoft have gone in on Delta in terms of the storage format. So it doesn't matter whether you're creating a lakehouse table or a warehouse table, the underlying storage is based on Delta. So that is a significant shift from the existing, technologies, and why it, it's more aligned with what you're doing with serverless SQL pools. But you get this SQL endpoint created, as part of this lakehouse creation, and that SQL endpoint is what allows you to write SQL against your data that's in your lakehouse.
So what you're saying is, when we start working with Microsoft Fabric, we need to make a choice between a warehouse as a storage or method or a lakehouse. But no matter what we choose, we still get some, not necessarily the same, but we get some SQL capabilities. We get a SQL endpoint on top of the lakehouse, and we have SQL capabilities directly inside the data warehouse itself. But they're similar but different, those two SQL capabilities.
Yes, yeah. And the differences are more syntax, which is preferable to, two different engines with its idiosyncrasies that you've got to understand. So, on the left-hand side with SQL endpoints, that's more of the lakehouse architecture, where you're not doing any, SQL-based loading or transformation. You're just able to access that data that's been transformed in the lakehouse, but you can just query it with the SQL endpoint. And ultimately, you can either use the SQL endpoints to build Power BI data sets and then ultimately reports, or connect directly to the lakehouse using Power BI data set and work from it there. But the most important thing to consider is that the SQL endpoint doesn't allow you to do any form of modification. So if you've written your data into the lakehouse, you've created your tables, let's say you've used Spark, you've used pipelines, Dataflow Gen 2, however you've landed that into the Delta format, what you then can't do is use the SQL endpoint to modify the data. So you can't go in and start updating and deleting, because it is an endpoint for querying, right? So that's where the functionality ends there in terms of what you do. And that makes sense, because otherwise, if you could go in and start modifying the data, it would, and this is just my opinion. Yeah. So one of people's criticisms of serverless SQL pools is that you couldn't modify data with it. But I always thought that made sense, because then you could get into a bit of a mess where you're writing data through one system and then modifying it with serverless. I was never a fan of adding that particular bit of functionality. So it's the same here with SQL endpoints, but we can create a warehouse. Yep. So we can go into Fabric and we can say, right, I want a warehouse. And that warehouse has got nothing to do with a lakehouse. Yeah. So it is a standalone warehouse artifact. That's the SQL service where you've got full DML, where you can insert, you can update, and you can delete. Yeah. So that'll be the storage format in which you can then import your data into a warehouse and work with it there, independent of it, being connected to a lake house. But the important thing is that we can mount a SQL endpoint, a lake house, into a warehouse and have access to it. Yeah. So when I spoke about dedicated and SQL pools not really able to talk to each other, we're able to do that here in terms of the whole data virtualization piece. So we can create a warehouse, we can mount a lake, one lake house, two lake houses, whatever, into that, and we can cross query and read. So we've got full compatibility again, with what we're doing with the data. It's just important to clarify that, because again, yes, there's going to be, I think there's going to be some confusion about what you can do with the SQL endpoint and the warehouse. People, you may go into a SQL endpoint, see the SQL script interface, and start trying to update data, and you'll get an error saying you can't update this data. So I think that's just worth calling out there in terms of the differences between a SQL endpoint and a warehouse.
So by choosing the warehouse, you're doubling down on SQL. Where you choose the lakehouse, you are opening up the possibility of doing something Python, something notebook, something more data engineering.
That's a great, Mathias, that is absolutely fantastic point to be made as well. Yes, and in fact, you could probably add to this slide data engineering above the SQL endpoint, and data warehousing above the warehouse. So, for example, if you are a SQL shop, and if you don't do a lot of Spark, maybe some light touch Spark in terms of loading data, but you are a SQL-based shop. And let's be honest, there's going to be lots and lots of data teams out there that are running on-premise SQL Server or SQL Server in the cloud, or using Azure SQL database or dedicated SQL pools for warehousing. They're going to be writing SQL.
Absolutely.
So with creating a warehouse, you've got full support support for SQL. I'll be honest, I can't remember what is and isn't supported yet in terms of the SQL syntax, but if you've got your SQL-based ETL or ELT processes, then the warehouse is going to be perfect. Because you're going to be able to create your stored procedures with all your loading logic. You're going to be able to put those stored procedures into pipelines and orchestrate the loading and running of those stored procedures. So I think anyone coming into Fabric and thinking, oh, okay, so now I've got to use Spark to do all of my data engineering and loading. No. You can if you are a Spark shop. So you can come in and use the Lakehouse and use notebooks and do all that funky stuff with PySpark. But if you are a SQL shop, then Warehouse has
for you,
got you covered.
Yep.
And it's all going to be over the same data, and it's all going to be surfaced through the same, the same connection string, the same objects in the end. That's a great call out, Mathias.
Should we dive into it? I'm assuming you have some details on the inner workings, but what can we do? What's inside? What's the file? Yeah, you said you had something about file format stuff like that. Yeah.
So I think the first thing is around the data storage format. Which is probably the biggest departure that we've seen in terms of a storage format for Microsoft in one of their main database products, because we are now using Delta. So which is backed by the Parquet. Backed by the Parquet file format. And I have seen, those that are more familiar with Power BI getting a bit worried about Delta and having to understand Parquet and things like that. And I don't think you're going to need to be too worried about understanding the mechanics at this stage. Yes,
you need to understand it the same way you had to understand the inner workings of a data flow storage files, and basically you didn't need to understand that either. I mean, you need to understand how you work with it, not what's going on inside of it.
Yeah, and there are. I mean, for example, I to be honest with you, I couldn't explain to you the inner workings of a .mdf file and a .ldf file in a SQL server. I know what they are and I know what they contain, but other than that, no. It's the same here. Now, there are optimizations that will be applied to the storage and settings that you can apply. So again, there's documentation around how Microsoft have implemented certain optimization features, within Delta. But Delta is, effectively underpinning the storage mechanism here. It's, as we've touched on, it's a SaaS platform. So, you're going to configure your Fabric capacity with a certain amount of compute, a certain amount of cores, and that's going to be shared. So your Spark workloads, your Power BI workloads, your pipelines and data flows, your SQL endpoints, Lakehouse, warehouse, it's all going to use that shared compute. So we don't, again, have to worry about understanding the different types of compute from all the different services. But with that, you're relinquishing a certain amount of power, in being able to configure the compute and isolate it from itself. But yes, so do we truly have this separation of storage and compute? Well, yes, the storage format is in Delta, and there's been lots of discussions out there about the ability to write Delta into Fabric by outside engines. So for example, Databricks, again, very, very, probably, the ubiquitous data processing platform, for Spark. But the storage, i.e. the Delta data, which stores the data, the schema, the statistics, the transaction logs, everything is self-contained. And then the compute can just come along, whether it's Fabric compute, Databricks compute, Synapse compute, whatever, and talk to that data. And then we touched on that cross querying. So, ultimately under the umbrella term of data virtualization, where we want to process our data once and then try and reuse it as much as possible without moving it. Yeah. Now, maybe we're not too worried about costs in terms of copying data, because it's relatively inexpensive to store that data. But obviously, as data volumes grow, if you are copying data around, it takes time as well, right?
Yep.
So if you can minimize the amount of times you're moving and copying data around, it's going to speed everything up. But you can cross query lake houses and warehouses, so that you're not having to repeat loading from a source into multiple different areas within Fabric, duplicating data. So what I'll do is I'm going to bring these two up, Autoscale and self-optimizing, because it's a software as a solution service. When we're running SQL workloads, then those workloads are going to be taking the compute that they require to get their jobs done, as quickly as possible. Now, there's probably going to be some more information coming about the way that the Fabric compute works with the workloads that are being given to it. So we've got, this concept of bursting workloads. We've got the concept of smoothing, where yes, you're going to buy a certain amount of capacity, but if certain workloads need to maybe go beyond that a little bit, then it can burst, it can smooth out. So there's going to be some great information about what the compute is doing under the hood. But suffice to say is, when you're running workloads within Fabric, it's going to be auto scaling to be able to, to get those workloads done. the interesting point there, 6, self-optimizing. So when I say no more workload groups, so within dedicated SQL pools, you had the concept of being able to create a single dedicated SQL pool, let's say 600 gig of RAM. Yeah. And it was, 10 DWU 1,000. So it's two compute nodes. What you could do is you could take that dedicated SQL pool and you could partition it off in terms of the resources. So, for example, you could create a workload group in dedicated just for ETL and say that always gets 50%. Yes, it's going to get 300 gig. It's going to get the compute power that's associated with 50% all the time. But it's not going to get any more than 50%. Then you could have 25% that's dedicated to just querying, and then another 25% for, let's say, downstream loading of models or ML integration or something like that. But you had to set that up. You had to go in and configure that. Otherwise, dedicated would just say, oh, okay, well, a user's going to come in and I'll give, the user that amount of compute based on their user settings, and then that's it. I'll just do it based on that. But here we've got self-optimizing. Yeah. So again, I want some more information about the self-optimizing part of this. Yeah, because that then means that the boundaries of the workloads are going to be shifting. Yeah. So when my SQL-based workloads are happening, and I've also got some Power BI workloads over here, and then maybe some Spark workloads and ML workloads, it's going to be self-optimizing itself.
Yeah.
That's going to be closely linked in with.
But we also want to protect ourselves. I mean, we don't want one notebook with a wonky Spark job ruining everything else within our Fabric capacity. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to add that in our last session of the day, starting at 3 in the afternoon, Central European time, we will go more into depths of what we know about capacities and pricing in Fabric. So just a little teaser there.
Brilliant. Yes. So that's 3 essential things. Pick a workload, understand one lake, and then understand the licensing. Yes. It's all these things are adding up now.
Exactly.
But in terms of, I'm just having a look at the time. So in terms of loading data, getting data around. So in the Synapse data warehouse, if we've created our own warehouse, we can use the most recommended command to load data in. So this was the command that was most recommended for dedicated SQL pools, which is copy. Yeah. So the copy command, you can think of the copy command as, it's just a SQL statement where you point to external location, a data lake where you want to load your data into the warehouse, using SQL syntax and using some options there to maybe auto create the table, etc. But that was the command that fully utilized scale out and parallel processing. So it's really good to see that here. But of course, we can also use pipelines, so data factory within Fabric, and data flow Gen 2. So there was a comment made. So forgive me, I'm just very quickly scrolling through, but there was a comment made about mapping data flows. Yeah. So conspicuously absent from Fabric at the moment. Yeah, those mapping data flows were just basically a visual way of creating Spark commands. Really, it's not here. What we do have is we have the Power Query ETL process in data flow Gen 2, which has obviously all those source connectors to connect to all your different data sources, but it now has destination. Absolutely. So I think it might have been Mim on Twitter talking about, or it might have been someone else, but talking about the fact that Dataflow Gen 2, hey, it's an ETL tool now.
Absolutely. So Andy, we have half a minute left. So can we wrap up and say for the users out there who either are coming from an on-prem SQL warehouse or Power BI users, or something like that, what is the key takeaways here? I mean, what is what's the key message here around warehouse?
The key message here is that your workloads will be supported. You don't have to worry. You don't have to worry. I've just taken this from the official Microsoft documentation, which shows that we've got all those data sources. We can ingest them. We can mount to get at copies of them. But in our data warehouse, we can transform using SQL. We've got our store procedures. We've got our happy place in terms of being able to use SQL to do our data warehousing. And then downstream, we can expose that with Power BI models. So I think the key takeaway is that, yes, we've got, there's going to be a lot of discussions about all the different ways and means that you can work with Fabric. But if you're coming from a SQL background, it's got you covered.
Absolutely awesome. So we are able to build an actual SQL data warehouse in Microsoft Fabric. Under the hood, it may use other tools and other storage formats and a lot of abstraction, but from our perspective, from a user perspective, it is a SQL-based data warehouse as we know and love it, and we can build it in Fabric.
Yeah, you work with it with SQL.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming, Andy. It has been an absolute pleasure and learningful as always, insightful as always. We will, if you send me the links, we can share them on the channel on the event as well. And
yes, we'll do.
Thank you for joining today, and enjoy the rest of the week tweaking more with Microsoft Fabrics. And to the viewers out there, we'll have a short lunch break now and be ready for the next session again at 1 p.m. So that's 1 in the afternoon, with the visit from Microsoft, Lars Andersen, Senior Program Manager from the Power BI CAT team, who will talk about the influence of Direct Lake for Power BI today. So thank you for coming, Andy, and have a nice day to every one of you. Enjoy. See you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.